Hi there. This is week 4 now, and this is our final week reading the Hebrew Bible. And as you're no doubt getting a sense, there's lots of stuff in the Hebrew Bible, and we're just scratching the surface. But this week we're going to read two very different kinds of material. The first is going to be from the book of Psalms, and these are poems. I'll talk about that in a moment. And then on the second class, we're going to be looking at prophecy, and the book of Amos is kind of the classic prophet. Both of these are in poetry, and I'm going to talk about what exactly that means in just a moment. But let me say something about where are we in the story of Israel? Where are we in the story of God and his people, his nation? We began with Abraham. Then we saw Moses taking the people out of Egypt into toward at least the promised land. Moses will receive the law, the 10 commandments. The people in the book of Joshua will leave the desert and come into the promised land under the leader Joshua. And then over time, we will have developed a kingdom within this small ancient state of Israel. And the main king that you've probably heard of in one way or another is the King David and his son Solomon. All right. Now, there's a lot of other kings that follow after that and things that happen, but David and Solomon are at the center of this kind of united kingdom of Israel. And that's kind of the golden age. Now, from our perspective of history, part of what's happening is that this is a time when ancient Egypt is particularly weak, and there's no real threats coming from Mesopotamia in the other direction. And so in that kind of power vacuum, there's a place for a small state to do pretty well. And that's the time when David and his son Solomon, think about 1000 to 900 BC, lived. You might recognize David from stories like David and Goliath. He's a singer. And those are the stories you might have heard about David. Now, the other thing that's going to happen under the monarchy is that there's going to be a temple that's built. And this is going to be the temple where all worship of Yahweh, the God of Israel, is going to be centered on this temple. And people will come from around Israel to this temple at different times of the year. And in this temple, there will be worship of Yahweh. And so a lot of what we have in the book of Psalms is are songs that were meant, at least some of them, for being performed in the temple. And that's where you have to imagine these. So these are an example of communal music and communal song, communal words offered up to God. Now, we're very used to today, I think maybe even devotionally, a lot of people use the Psalms as kind of individual words to themselves. And that's fine. That's what happens. But in their kind of origin, we should think of them more as communal statements. There are 150 Psalms in the book of Psalms, so it's quite a lengthy book. We're only reading the first 23. This will give you a taste of them, and there's lots of interesting things in those first 23. Make sure you do get to Psalm 23, though, because that is one of the best-known parts of the Bible. The 23rd Psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." It's a very beautiful psalm, and that's why I chose to get us up to that point. All right, so do read up to Psalm 23. Now, I mentioned that these are an example of poetry. So what do I mean by that? And a lot of times I'll introduce this in class and I'll say, how is this poetry? And people will struggle. It's not rhyming, and it's not that the translation doesn't use, it's just doesn't, even in the Hebrew, it doesn't have rhymes. I'm going to look to Psalm 6, just because you can do this with basically any psalm. Psalm 6. You'll note at the very beginning, by the way, there's in kind of fine print up at the top, "To the leader with stringed instruments, according to the Sheminith, a psalm of David." Okay, so what do we do with that? First of all, you see that there's a leader. We're up, there's this is a group musical performance where this is coming from, with stringed instruments. Again, we don't really know what that looked like or what it was, but there were musical instruments involved and a leader of song. According to the Sheminith, that's the tune this would have been sung to. Again, we don't know what that was, how that sounded, but it's evident that there was a tune, much as in a contemporary hymnal, it might say such and such a song to the tune of Greensleeves, something like that, right? This is a known tune, melody that would have been used for singing this. And then it says a psalm of David. And traditionally, much of the book of Psalms has been attributed to David, King David, who was said to be a musician and to play on the harp and things like that. I would say it's pretty clear that these aren't from the ancient world of David. These are from somewhat later, but notionally, the book of Psalms goes back to this great king of the monarchy who was said to be a musician, and they are of David. But I don't think that that should be taken as really the something to be taken in concrete form. Now let's get into the psalm itself. O Lord, do not rebuke me in your anger or discipline me in your wrath. Be gracious to me, O Lord, for I am languishing. O Lord, heal me, for my bones are shaking with terror. So what's poetic about that? Well, immediately you might think, my bones are I'm languishing, my bones are shaking with terror. There's a kind of concreteness in the language that we might recognize as terror. It's not just saying, I feel sick today. You know, it's poetic in the kind of expansive description of that feeling. So there's something that we immediately recognize. But something else is going on here that is really important to get for understanding the Psalms and Hebrew poetry, and that is parallelism. So there's always an A, and then there's a B. This is actually, if you look really closely at the way it's marked out in your text in the Bible, especially if you have the translation that I assigned, you'll see that, O Lord, do not rebuke me in your anger, and then it comes back and indents just a little bit, or discipline me in your wrath. Then out to the full end. Be gracious to me, Lord, for I am languishing. And then a little indentation. O Lord, heal me, for my bones are shaking with terror. So what you're getting here are an A statement and a B statement. And this is parallelism. That is the concept of Hebrew poetry, which is parallel, an A and a B, an A and a B. And these are basically the same syllable count, some small differences, but they're largely the same length of line. That doesn't always come through in the English. And then you're saying one thing, and then you're saying it again in a slightly different way. So there's always an A and a B. And there can be different relations. Sometimes the A and B is one of contrast. Sometimes it's straight up parallel. Sometimes there's an A leading to a B. So there's some room for innovation in there. But largely it's A balanced with B. A balanced with B. And that's a way of kind of building up a set of thoughts. Often the stanzas themselves are also A, B. There's just this kind of ingrained sense of parallelism that's in this poetry. So let's look at this, and I'll kind of try to mark out A, B as I'm reading. See how that comes across in the video here. O Lord, do not rebuke me in your anger, or discipline me in your wrath. Be gracious to me, O Lord, for I am languishing. O Lord, heal me, for my bones are shaking with terror. My soul also is struck with terror. While you, O Lord, how long? Turn, O Lord, save my life. Deliver me for the sake of your steadfast love. For in death there is no remembrance of you. In Shale, who can give you praise? All right, that just gives you a sense of A, B. There's this kind of balancing of phrase, balancing of an idea, and then a kind of concrete descriptor instead of just using flat words. That's how the poetry is working. Even in our next reading, when we turn to the book of Amos, you'll see that's a little more complex, but you'll see that same kind of thought going on. One other thing to notice here is this word shale. That's one thing that everything seems pretty straightforward. Then he says in verse 5, for in death there is no remembrance of you. In Shale, who can give you praise? And Shale is this place of darkness and shadows. Sometimes it's translated as hell, but that's really, we think of fire and flames as hell. But Shale is the place where the dead go. And this is something to really take note of when it comes to reading the Bible, and especially the Hebrew Bible, is that it doesn't have all the things that we expect For example, the afterlife. There is no heavenly afterlife described in the Hebrew Bible, these portions of it. There are hints in sections that are kind of the latest written, but in these central sections, there's no afterlife here, right? Turn, O Lord, save my life, deliver me, for in death there's no remembrance of you. In Shale, who can give you praise? And the concept of death here is very similar to what we see in other cultures at the time, like the Greeks. If you read the Odyssey or the Iliad, that there is a kind of a Hades. There's a dark shade place where the shade of a person goes after death, but it's not true life. It's not real life. It's a kind of empty, shadowy existence of continuation. So this author is saying, heal me, deliver me, because if I die, there's no way I'm going to worship you again. I am going to be, I won't be able to remember you and take part in this worship. And that's a reason maybe for God to heal this person, because death, there won't be this kind of living worship or consciousness anymore. So be aware of this, that the Bible it doesn't kind of fall into what we assume is going to be happening. And often people come and read the Bible with thoughts about heaven and the afterlife, and it's just not present in a large, 95% of the Hebrew Bible. You just really don't see that. Another thing is, if you look to Psalm 1, and this wasn't a psalm that was sung. It's the kind of introduction, the preface, you might even say, to the book of Psalms. And so it's more of a wisdom psalm than one that we think went back to worship in the temple. But note the moral universe that we're entering here. Happy are those who don't follow the advice of the wicked, or take the path that sinners tread, or sit in the seat of scoffers. But their delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law they meditate day and night. They are like trees planted by streams of water, which yield their fruit in its season, and their leaves do not wither. In all that they do, they prosper. The wicked are not so, but are like chaff that the wind drives away. Therefore, the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. So this is this kind of opening card, so to speak, in the book of Psalms. And it really presents us with a kind of stark moral universe, that there's a way of the righteous and a way of the wicked. There are these two paths. And the way of the righteous will prosper like a tree planted by streams of water. The way of the wicked may seem to prosper, but it will ultimately fail. So what is this world? God rewards the righteous, and he destroys or brings to naught the way of the wicked. And that is something of a faith statement about God's acting in this life. It's not saying in the afterlife, one person will go to heaven, the other person will go to hell. It's saying in this life, God will make prosper the righteous, and the wicked will perish. Well, their plans will be brought to naught. All right. So these are these two things. And this is a somewhat simplistic moral universe. And in contrast, by the way, you'll notice that the book of Job is right before Psalms. And the book of Job is the ultimate in kind of questioning whether things always work out quite so nicely. So Job is a righteous person, but then all these bad things happen to him. So the Bible has these different kinds of voices. It's not one answer to everything. In the book of Job, you get a little bit more of an individual questioning. What happens when things don't go right? And that's something that we could spend a couple of weeks reading, but we don't have time. That's the book of Job. Here in the Psalms, we turn into another world, which is one that is largely pretty confident of its values and the morals. God helps the righteous. He hurts the unrighteous. The way of the righteous will prosper. The way of the wicked will perish. One is like a tree planted by streams of water. It blooms. The other is like chaff that the wind blows away. And that's fairly simplistic moral vision, but a powerful one too, about the reason for following God. And I guess what I'd like to kind of point out and say about that is the Psalms are a place of communal worship. It's more a place to put forward what usually happens, what ought to happen, what we affirm will happen. Do good, play by the rules, God will make you prosper. Work hard, do things, this is this kind of thinking. And we all know, and maybe everyone in the congregation would know, that things aren't always quite so clear in real life. But as a kind of statement of communal values and communal belief, this is what is being put forward uh, by the Psalms. And often that's what we'll find is these larger community statements rather than individual the exceptions to what ought to happen or what usually happens. And I think you'd see the same thing if you go into a place of worship today, is that as communities, there's an affirmation of the big picture. And then in the books and in the thought of more complex thinkers, there's a kind of a questioning as to why doesn't that work all the time, or what is the answer to these exceptions. All right. So what we have here in the Psalms is a book of communal worship and affirmation of community values. And that's the way I think to begin to read the Psalms. Again, read from Psalm 1 up to Psalm 23. What I'm going to do is not have you respond in Moodle. You did a lot of writing and stuff for last week. We're not going to do that. But what I want you to have is one passage that you like from the Psalms, all right, that you could point to that's concrete here in the Psalms. Say it's chapter 18, verses 20 to 22, whatever it is. Be able to point to something concrete. I'm going to go around the class. I won't get to everybody, but I will get to a number of you, and we'll just kind of ask you to say what it is that a passage that you liked or you found intriguing in some way. And we'll talk about that for a moment. Okay, why that's intriguing, what the answer is to your question. Be ready to do that. The only way you'll get marked down for this week is I call on you and you don't have a passage ready to go. All right. So give that some thought, and I'll see you tomorrow morning, and enjoy the Psalms.